This is David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lions Roar podcast. Today I want to talk about training people to fight, having fighters, running a fighting gym. Sort of really, it's also like the how you train people to fight and why Kung Fu people can't fight. There obviously is Kung Fu places where they don't do any sparring at all. And then there's schools, whether they're martial arts schools or Kung Fu schools, where people spar and they'll go to tournaments and they'll do stuff, even if they do these, they call them Sancho events now, but they're really not the same level as what I was doing, until about 2005. It's a different level. That's hobbyists. When we used to have the USAWKF, the official national tournament for the champions and the people that were sent to the worlds that were going to go fight. And again, remember that like on the international level, the whole idea of amateurs doesn't exist. You're fighting professionals. Those tournaments, with the big 6 teams, which were training full-time to fight, they weren't professional by the definitions that we have now of professional and amateur, but they weren't like hobbyists. Most people doing martial arts now are hobbyists, and like the kind of people that just sparred in their school that would come and fight in the USAWKF tournament against people like Boston Sancho and my team and Kung Lee's team and Scott Sheely's team and Mike Altman's team and the Oakland team. They would not be able to compete at that level. And a part of what I would say is that when people were doing Kung Fu back in the quote-unquote old days, they were doing it more at that level. I remember when I was training with Chan Tai San, I was training 6 days a week. I was training multiple hours in a day. The hobbyist thing is always going to be different than the dedicated thing. And in this environment, obviously if you want to fight at even a high amateur level, you're not doing hobbyists. I mean, my fighters, the guys that, fought and did very well in different formats, they were training basically every day. They were the kind of people that lived in the gym. And our fight practices were 2 to 3 hours. And they were very hard. I mean, a good 1/3 of what I did was conditioning, which again it's interesting how people think like preparing for, like, for example, for MMA is so different than training for Chinese martial arts. Chinese martial arts, well, you were training a long time, and they always talk about all this conditioning. Conditioning is everything. I mean, one of the biggest strategies, secrets that we had, so to speak, was that we knew that most people in most fights were going to go really, really hard in the first round, and then we're going to gas out, and then you would go after them. So the whole idea was, almost like a spider's web: draw them in, let them get tired, and then go after them. Or at least, and when my guys got really confident, they would just look for when that drop-off would be, or look for a weakness, and then they would exploit it. And so sometimes we would take people out in the first round. In tournament Sancho, again, everything in Chinese martial arts is a double-edged sword. It was the best of 3, so you didn't actually fight 3 rounds most of the time. If you won the first 2, you didn't go on to the third. And so we learned how to, even with that, let them gas out in the first, but still win the first, and then go after them in the second, and then there was very few third rounds. Then, of course, obviously, when we're doing Thai and stuff, then, you are doing a third round, a fourth round, a fifth round in big fights. And in MMA, we were doing fights like that. But a lot of conditioning. This is a big difference. Most people are hobbyists, and so it's hard to compare when people are doing, like, 2 or 3 classes a week and maybe 1-hour classes, as opposed to the kind of people that, were trained to fight. Now, I've discussed this on numerous occasions. Why did I train so many people to fight? Well, I was interested in it, obviously, but I really wanted to prove that Kung Fu could work. The techniques that I had learned from Chan Tai San and in Choi Jiao and stuff could work. But, also, once I got into it, I was looking at the methods to make it work. I wanted to prove, not only, prove that it could work, but figure out how to make it work. And so, I said a couple of times that, after doing it 94 to 2006 or so, about 12 years or so of doing it, I kind of felt like I had done what I needed to prove, because the other thing I'm going to talk about is that it's very hard to run a gym based upon fighters. People try all the time, and for example, a lot of people think, well, if I run a gym based upon fighters, I'll get a lot of people that want to train in that gym because it's very successful. I'll be very well known. This doesn't really happen. You're very well known, but again, you're known in the fight world where, everybody has their own gym and their own fighters, and other fighters know you, and people will come through from time to time to train with you. But as far as a business model, as far as like helping you run your gym, fighters don't do that. And I would argue in a lot of ways, they stop you from doing that. First of all, just time-wise, getting people ready for fights is different than helping people achieve their goals and being happy and running classes. So you're going to divert a lot of your attention to your fighters. You're going to spend your weekends going to fights. I used to joke covered in Vaseline, sweat, and blood, and Thai oil. And that's true. You spend time away from your family. You spend money going away, especially because you start off everybody as an amateur, and so there's not a lot of money in it. Though, spoiler alert, even when you do pros, you don't make a lot of money. Pros, in most things, don't get paid very well at the low level, and very few people get to the high level. In boxing, I did amateur boxing. I did the Golden Gloves thing, and one of the things that they told us at one of the coaches' meetings was the fact that, in the boxing world, 1% of the people makes 100% of the money. Not like 99%, they make 100%. In other words, most people run boxing gyms because they love boxing and they love working with people in boxing. But, even when people get somebody that's an up-and-comer, usually what happens is they get snatched off by those 1% people, the promoters that, offer them lucrative contracts and can tell them that they can set them up and everything. And so it's like 1% controlling 100% of the money in that sport. Kickboxing at the very beginning was like $200-300. Even MMA at the low level was like $500-600. Not the kind of money that you're going to, live comfortably on. And as a manager, you're entitled to 33%. When I had pro fighters, most of the time I didn't take a dime from them. A lot of them were guys that had bills to pay. Some of them had kids. I want to take money that they needed to buy diapers and formula so that I could, go home with, 30% of $600. It's just not worth it. I wasn't doing it for that. I was doing it to prove a point, and at a certain point, I was beyond proving that point. It's not, no matter how successful you are. And I remember, I had national champions in Sancho. I had world champions in Sanda. I had people that had amateur titles in Muay Thai. I had people that went and fought in Thailand. I had amateur and professional titles in MMA. I had fighters where literally, sometimes I was in every fight on the card. It did not translate into people coming through the door. And in fact, it translates into people leaving the door, because think about the nature of people that want to do this kind of fighting. Just like Kung Fu people. And I've said before, if you want to know, in the people in the past in Kung Fu could fight. They certainly existed. We can name a lot of them. I've trained with some of them. Chan Tai San's a good example. It wasn't just the technique, it was also kind of an attitude. That Chan ruthlessness kind of mentality in Lama Pai that certainly applied to Chan Tai San. The average person doesn't want to spend every day of their life in a sweaty gym working out, fighting with other people, and bleeding and getting black eyes and cuts and stuff. It's a unique kind of person. Also, to be a successful fighter, I always say that fighters have to believe that they can beat anybody. I knew guys that thought that they could beat UFC champions at their peak, and they were low-level amateurs. You have to sort of believe that. Because if you get into the ring or the cage thinking that you aren't as good as the person you're fighting, of course, that's not a recipe for success. And the flip side of that is the coach has to know the reality, and so you're always coming in conflicts. But these kind of people, they're territorial. So, classically, you would walk into my gym. I had a ring back then, and they'd be sitting all around the ring. And people would want to join, and they would look at them like they were fresh meat. And I literally had experiences where I had somebody take like an intro package, 6 classes, and I was hoping to get them to join, and then one of my professional fighters would break their arm, and of course the guy wouldn't pay me, and would disappear, or get beaten up in their first class and not join because of that. People walk in, and also the fighters are wearing the same clothing for like 27 weeks in a row, and I'm not even exaggerating with that. And they just sparred, so now he has the canvas covered in sweat, but also in blood, and maybe one guy's eye is swollen shut. This is not the kind of thing that makes people want to join programs. And then I said, the next step of that also is you always have some tension, because you're going to bring them up, and inevitably, when they become very successful, most fighters then suddenly think, wow, must have been born this great fighter. And they don't often appreciate the people that coach them. And ask anybody about this. It's not just me. Anybody who's been coaching knows it's a thankless job. It's an unappreciated job. And if you've been doing it for a long time, you've had people left. And martial arts teachers have this experience also. But it's in aces and spades when it's, when you're training fighters. It's just the nature. I mean, because fighters think they're invincible, and your job is to know that they're not, and to know what their weaknesses are, and to know, to protect them. One of the biggest issues is that everybody wants to be pro. There's a million jokes in the fight world about, I've had 3 fights now, it's time for me to go pro. Or I've had 3 fights and lost all 3 of them, but it's time for me to go pro. This is kind of nuts, but yet it sounds kind of nuts, but it's exactly what everybody thinks that they want to be. And as I've explained to fighters, in the fight game, what generally happens is a promoter will find a fighter that they think will sell a lot of tickets. And so they want to keep promoting them because they keep bringing in tickets. So they will promote that fighter, and they will try to give them titles and run the promotion through that fighter. So when they're looking for somebody to fight that person, they want that person to lose. They're looking for somebody that they know is less to fight. That's how most fighters are. When I matchmake, I didn't do that. People always thought that was strange. I have different worldviews on things. But let's just be honest in the fight. So, for example, when I had to fire Danielle, that we couldn't get a fight for her anywhere in New York or New Jersey, and we had to go all the way up to Massachusetts, and she had to agree to fight a girl that was in a weight class above her, and the girl was the best friend of the promoter. And everybody was like, I just came here to get your butt kicked, but they didn't do their homework, and we won. But that's generally what happens. They agreed to Danielle because they looked and they said, well, she's smaller, and we can't, I don't know why they couldn't find a record, because she had fought. But, again, she had fought MMA only once, but she had a great wrestling background, and she had done Thai boxing with me, and I guess, Thai boxing doesn't have a database like MMA does. They were just convinced that she was going to lose. So, a lot of times you're not going to be offered a title unless you're affiliated with a promoter, and the promoter is trying to push you through. Or if you're a good ticket seller, I've had that too. I had fighters that promoters liked because they were good ticket sellers, and my school was big and sold a lot of tickets. And we knew that when we were offered titles, it wasn't a big deal because we knew. I remember one guy got offered a title in kickboxing, K-I-C-K, there's that organization. That guy got really nervous and everything. I said, you're going to win the fight. He goes, how do you know that? I go, because the reason you were offered this fight was because, the school sells a lot of tickets and they like you, and you're, kind of the poster boy. He was a good-looking kid, and, he's personable and everything. I hate to say that, but that's the way this thing is. So if you're not in that kind of relationship and you're looking for a title fight, and again, what does it mean? Especially an amateur. What does a title mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's, I could go out and buy you the belt and put it around you. And I also think that and this is the problem I've had a lot of, turning pro. There's something weird about turning pro. You can be an amateur and you can, start off with 3-4 fights, and I've had amateurs go up to 25 fights. There's a certain point, you hit glass ceiling with amateur. But you need to have a bunch of fights as an amateur before you go pro. Because as an amateur you can grow, but once you turn pro, that's where you are. And so, for example, one of the classic stories I have is I have a guy that had a great wrestling background, but his first couple of MMA fights, he was fighting guys that were just not as skilled, and he was just a better wrestler, and he was always getting top positions and controlling the fight and everything. And I said to him, if you want to progress, I want to see the fight where you're fighting somebody that's a better wrestler and you're on your back and you're losing, and at least you adjust. Not necessarily that you're winning. That's important to understand. it's not important that you win. It's important that I say that you can at least adjust or not completely fall apart. Because some people, they have like, 5 wins, 6 wins, and they have their first tough fight, and not only do they lose, but they lose. I mean, like, things don't go well. And I pointed out, I went and trained with Randy Couture when he was at Team Quest, and he said the most important fight for him was when he fought Kevin Randleman, because Kevin Randleman, he says, was a bigger, stronger, better wrestler. And so he says, it's one thing to know that I'm going to get the takedown and be on top, but what happens when I'm fighting a better wrestler? I'm on the bottom. And because Randy Couture is a very smart guy, he worked a lot of bottom, he learned a lot of guard game. And the way the fight went was that at the very beginning, Randleman took him down, and Couture didn't get knocked out, didn't get submitted, obviously, because he worked all that stuff. And then later in the fight, when Randleman gassed out and Randy got on the top, then, he said literally, like, Randleman didn't know what to do on the bottom. His feet went up like, like a dead fly, like, and that was the end. So it's the same thing with this guy. I said, I want to see you have a bad fight before you go pro. And the thing you hear all the time, oh, you're holding me back, you're holding me back. Yeah, you'd be the champion of the world if it wasn't for me holding you back. Just as an aside, of about, I don't know, I lost count, but about 500 fighters that I've trained in different formats, a few have left and tried to go fight after me, and none have been successful. Or they're successful for a short period of time. One of my favorite things is that somebody can have like 12 fights under me. So they should be fighting guys that have like 9, 10 fights easily, right? They shouldn't be fighting people with no fights because they have like 12 fights. And the difference between somebody with like 3 fights and somebody with no fights, or the difference between somebody with like 7 fights and 3 fights, it is geometrically more competitive at higher levels. I have guys that would have like 10 fights beating up guys that had like 3 or 4 fights, and the 3 or 4 fight guys in the regular classes were like monsters. And then you deal with guys like, from the international teams that have had like 40 or 50 fights. You're talking about like a completely different animal whatsoever. Adam Resnick was like 20-something fights in, and, 20-something knockouts. And then we had Yusuf, who defected from the Iranian team, who probably had 60 or 80 fights. And watching those two guys go at each other, it was like watching, King Kong and Godzilla going at each other. And I had guys like Rich Acosta, who was offered a K1 contract, who was maybe on his 14th or 15th fight, going, I don't want to go anywhere near those guys. This is nuts. It's a different story. But I said, I want to see if, I'm not holding you back. I was saying what I was saying was that people leave, and what will happen is they'll go to another gym, and the guy will go, well, you've never fought with me, so I'll advertise you as a 0 fighter or a 1 fight fighter. And so what happens is, if you leave my gym, you leave any gym, and this happens in other gyms, not just with me, but it's very common actually. It's amazing how these things replicate themselves. You fight with a team, you get like 9 or 10 fights, and then you have a disagreement because the coach is quote unquote holding you back, or whatever the reason is. And they'll go and they'll fight for somebody else, and the first couple of fights, you'll have 12 fights, and they'll set you up advertising you as not having all those fights. They may say you have 0 fights or 1 fight or something like that, and they'll put you against a 0 or 1, and of course you're going to beat that guy. It's not even close. But then you can't keep doing that, because whatever promoters that guy's dealing with, that new coach, he can't keep putting you on the same show and saying you're a 0 or a 1 fighter. He's got to say, yeah, you have 2 fights, 3 fights, and then you start fighting people that are more your level, and then, the truth comes out. So, as I was saying, I had this guy. He was a good wrestler. He was open for training. We worked a lot of things. We worked striking. He had some really good fights. But he never had that bad fight, that, fight where he was fighting the better wrestler and he was on the bottom. And again, I said, I didn't care if he fought the better wrestler, if he won, but I wanted to see him at least adjust. Because when you get into the big fights, if you've watched some of the big fights in the UFC, for example, it's the comeback thing. It's being able to adjust. It's having a bad round and coming back from that bad round. It's ending up on the bottom and surviving until, you find some way to get on top, sweep, or just survive that round. And I wanted to see that kind of thing happen. But, I was being accused of holding the fighter back, holding the fighter back, holding the fighter back. They arranged a title fight for themselves. Normally, my belief, and most coaches is, the coach sets up fights. Fighters don't set up their own fights. Remember, fighters will believe that they can beat anybody. The coach's job is to know you can't beat somebody. It's just not the way things worked. But because this person was who they were and they had been so aggressive in this thing, I said, well, let's do this. Okay, so you want to fight. I wanted to prove a point. And they ended up fighting. Obviously, like I said, it was a title fight. It was clearly a setup. Like I said, these kind of setups. The promoter wanted the other guy to win. The other guy was bigger. The other guy had more experience. And the fight in the first round went badly. He was smaller. My guy was smaller. He wasn't as good a wrestler. So he ended up getting taken down. He ended up being on the bottom. He ended up eating a lot of punches. And he completely fell apart, which is, the absolute worst scenario, which is not only did he not, adjust to deal with this fight, he fell completely apart to the point where, we were sitting trying to get him, reorganized on the stool. And, of course, the doctors come over in a regulated MMA event and look at you. And he looked at the doctor and said, "I'm done." If you know anything about combat sports, looking at the doctor and saying, "I'm done," that's it. Period. It's over. It's not even sometimes people have bad calls. You're sitting there and you're trying to get a cut fixed, or you're trying to get some swelling down, or you're trying to get the fighter to breathe, and the doctor will, stick their head and go, "I'm not sure," but that kind of stuff is different. I've seen fights called premature. But if you look at the doctor and say, "I'm done," then you're done. So they lost by their own hand because, they were losing it, inside. And one of the things, the good part about competing, again, I've been talking about, the difference between hobbyists and, dedicated amateurs even, or dedicated, forget about professional, dedicated amateurs, is you learn a lot about yourself from training and from fighting. Not just about your technique, but about yourself. It's the most important thing about doing combat sports for martial arts people. You learn a lot about yourself. And this guy, upset that he had lost this fight, went in the back and took a chair and threw it through a window. Let me say it again. He gave up on the stool, turned to the doctor and said, "I'm done," then was shocked that the fight was called, was angry at himself, and threw a chair through a window. And so, the commission was either going to ban him for life or at least suspend him for a year. Now, people forget things, right? It's been a long time. I've been doing this a long time. I haven't even been training fighters for a long time. But I was very active with the New Jersey State Athletic Commission. The original rules for amateur MMA were written by me and Steve Ventura and pushed through by Paul Rosner when Paul Rosner was alive. So I had a very, very good relationship with the commission. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the people that work for the commission are people that were trained by me, right? Which makes the amusing the story about them investigating me because they sent my own students to watch me rap. And I would joke with them. I go, "How are you going to watch me rap when I've taught you how to rap hands?" But I had a very good relationship. So I stepped in. And because the guy was a member of my team, the commission overlooked it. Now, most people would say rationally, "Wow, wasn't that guy so happy that he didn't get suspended for life, or suspended for a year and got to fight?" No, because this is the nature of fighters. Fighters just tend to always look to blame somebody else. That's most people in general, but it's particularly true of fighters. And my friends that have trained fighters, you can feel like you can jump in here at any time and agree with me. It's true. So they left him go to another team, thinking that the other team would get them a title fight. And I guess because my guy was popular on the circuit, had been seen before. He had actually fought guys on that team and beaten them. So they arranged for him to get a title fight. But he got knocked out in that fight. And that was the end of his career. Didn't fight after that. This is the problem with fighters. You're dealing with people like this. I mean, I had a guy that was very, very good, and he was 170 pounds at a time that, this was the time when George St. Pierre was the 170, and 170 was like the most successful division in MMA. And the guy was a monster. I mean, we used to call him the sponge because he just soaked up everything. Like whatever coach I brought in, I had a Greco-Roman coach, and I had a jiu-jitsu coach in the gym. We were getting everybody ready and for fights and everything. And I said to the guy, you could have a really, really successful career as an MMA fighter. You could make a lot of money. And he was a guy that could have used the money too, if you know what I mean. But he got in his head that he wanted to be a Thai fighter and go to Thailand and fight in Thailand. And I said, you have to remember something. When you go to Thailand, I mean, great. They're the best fighters in the world there, especially for striking, kickboxing kind of stuff. You're not getting a lot of exposure. As a matter of fact, a lot of people go and fight in Thailand because then they can come back here and pretend they're amateurs because there's no records, for what's going on in Thailand. You're not going to get famous here fighting in Thailand. And also, if you're not a Thai fighting in the stadiums, you're not going to get a lot of money. Decided to go to Thailand and fight. Came back and said the same thing to me. Wow, it was cool. I learned a lot of stuff. The fights were great. I have all that experience. But I could have been an MMA fighter. Fighters, just, they have their own things. I had a guy that was a great stand-up fighter, wanted to do MMA, and I said, well, that's great, but you got to learn to wrestle and fight on the ground, especially fight on the ground. And, again, you're probably going to be an animal standing up. You're going to, so you're going to end up in a guard. They're going to end up on the bottom, and they're going to pull guard, and you better be prepared for the inevitable, which is that when people pull guard, they go for triangle chokes or arm bars. At the time, I had a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach, so I wasn't preparing people for the ground. I was leaving it up to my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach. Well, the guy was a several-time champion in several different striking sports didn't bother to work with a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach. So again, he floored the guy in the MMA fight, killed him standing up, ended up in the guard and got triangled. And from the time it hit the ground to the time of the triangle and the tapping out, it was 30 seconds. Basic stuff. Got really angry. I said, well, but did you work this stuff? Well, no. Well, there you go. There you have it. So, the problem with fighters is that it's a thankless job. They chase away the people that, it would come in and support your gym. They're just very difficult to deal with, and you're going to have a sweaty gym, a nasty gym. When I consult people for business consulting, all the things I tell you not to do with your gym, they're going to do to your gym. They'll do dumb stuff too. I mean, the one that stands out to me was I bought a very expensive set of Thai pads, right, for the fighters. But I said, leave them outside, in the training room, hanging on the wall. Well, they were afraid that somebody might touch their pads, like the gorilla thing. So they decided to take them into the locker room and leave them in a locker with no lock. And so they got stolen because somebody went through the lockers, and since they were in a locker room where nobody could see them, you just take the locker out and throw it in a bag and walk out with them, And good Thai pads can be very expensive. This is the kind of thing you're dealing with. It kind of, like I said, if you get these kind of people, you'll get a little insight into, like I said, the old school kung fu person that could fight because they weren't hobbyists. They were dedicated to training and training very hard. But as a practical matter, training fighters is a completely thankless job that's going to, put you in debt, and your family's going to hate you because you're spending time with them, not, with the fighters, not with your family, and it's not going to have a practical, transition. So, I don't know what else to say to you about this. I wanted to share this. It was just sort of on the top of my mind. And then the other lesson, like I said, is that what you learn there are lessons to learn from this. I'm glad I did it. I mean, for example, I feel like I have nothing more to prove to somebody. If somebody walks in my gym now and goes, well, how do you know about training fighters? I have thousands of hours of video. I have trained, like I said, about 500 fighters. You learn things from, doing this that, like, for example, that you have to learn what happens when the fight goes wrong, not when the fight goes right. It's easy to learn, and learn. One of the most important things a fighter learns is what to do after a loss. and that's like a life lesson too. You know, like when things don't go well, pick yourself up and, you know, keep going forward. There's good things to learn from combat sports. So, you know, when I do stuff like this, I always do it with like a, you know, like half-heartedly, because I don't want to say don't do it at all. But yet, everybody that does it knows this, like, you know, thankless a thing about it. You know, and you end up, they don't want to deal with the regular classes, and you have to train them on the side, so it's a thankless job. Again, thank you for tuning in. This is David Ross, and this is The Lion's Roar.